on talking about Sarovic's model for pathogenetic triad. I'll get on to the triady bit in a moment. So he suggests that there's a separation of two mechanisms. So I guess this part of the triad, the two mechanisms. There's a third mechanism as well, obviously, because it's a triad. I'll get on to that. So separation of two mechanisms. Autistic personality dimension, which exists continually, he proposes, in the general population. The traits exist continually in the general population. And NB, which is the neuropathological burden. So there's what he calls a cognitive compensation complex. The cognitive compensation complex dysfunction. So the neuropathological burden implies a cognitive compensation complex dysfunction, where the person is not able to cognitively compensate for the traits. That's what that means. Cognitive compensation complex dysfunction. That's what the neuropathological burden is. And that's because they've been exposed to risk and therefore have lower cognitive capacity. So personality is inherited and it's not pathological in itself. The NB-CC, that's the neuropathological burden plus cognitive compensation complex dysfunction, is shared across disorders and increases the risk of all of them. So I guess it's also seen in schizophrenia too. So you have basically the triad. Now we're getting on to the triad, okay? Because we're getting on to the meat of it. The triad, the pathogenetic triad, is basically traits which in and of themselves are not necessarily pathological, exposure to risk, and then that increases the risk of a person's traits becoming a disorder, because it's the interaction between the traits and the risk that then results in disorder. The traits in and of themselves are not necessarily a disorder. So basically he suggests a personality domain where you have autistic traits, there might be schizotypal traits, there might be ADHD traits. And this is basically a neuropsychiatric personality profile that the person might have. These traits are normally distributed in the general population, he argues. So obviously not everyone has a personality profile governed by these traits, because that would only be people who have very, very pronounced traits. And most people in the general population only have a small number of the traits, and therefore wouldn't have a personality for any of those types of conditions. You only get a personality, you would only have an autistic personality if the number of traits is like really pronounced. And the personality traits that the person has would determine which condition the person is at risk of developing. Of course, the person could be at risk of developing multiple conditions. So if you have very few of the traits, you are what is called prototypically neurotypical. However, it is very statistically unlikely for anyone to be prototypically neurotypical, because the traits are continually distributed across the population. So in other words, the prototypical neurotypical is a little bit of a myth, because they basically have to be someone who is extremely normal, which is kind of very rare, because most people do have at least some of the traits. Like it's normal for many people to need routine, and you know, lots of people struggle a bit with eye contact, and you know, might be a bit socially awkward. A prototypical neurotypical would be like, yeah, really, they wouldn't have any traits of anything. So in a sense, everyone's neurodiverse. Yeah. And clinical samples Oh, and the other important thing, by the way, is clinical samples are more likely to fulfil criteria for multiple disorders due to the neuropathological burden, cognitive compensation, dysfunction complex. So it's the norm rather than the exception for clinical samples to have more than one condition. And yeah, as I've already mentioned, prototypical neurotypicality is statistically unlikely as everyone has more or less of all of these traits, so the potential and also the potential to experience issues from several of them. So if you have low exposure to risk and a high IQ and high executive functioning, the person probably won't have a diagnosis. The more pronounced the autistic traits are, the higher the executive functions have to be to allow the person to compensate and not warrant clinical attention. So yeah, so if someone has really, really high number of autistic traits, obviously that increases the amount of compensation they have to do. They have to compensate a lot more than, say, if someone only has a few autistic traits. So if they manage to avoid clinical attention but have loads of autistic traits and it's really intense, obviously that suggests that executive functioning is really good and their IQ is likely to be really high in order to kind of compensate sufficiently. Whereas someone with a lower IQ or lower executive functioning might end up with a diagnosis. Conversely, if someone has only a few autistic traits, but their cognitive compensation is really poor and their executive functioning is really low, even having a few autistic traits might still mean they end up getting a diagnosis, because those traits could become really problematic if they don't have the ability to compensate for them sufficiently enough. And yeah, individuals with few autistic traits can still have a mild ASD phenotype. They will have a lower need to compensate. Yeah, so yes, autistic traits, as I've already said, is autistic traits, is schizotypal traits, is ADHD traits, just to name a few. And the prototypical neurotypical has none of these traits. That's very unlikely, though, statistically, for anyone to literally have none of those traits at all. The more diagnosis means exposure to more risk factors. So, for example, if someone is diagnosed both autistic and ADHD, the expectation would be they've been exposed to more risk factors, maybe. But even if there is no diagnosis, even if there's no diagnosis, the profile increases. The profile is a risk factor. The personality profile is a risk factor for secondary mental health issues. And the other thing is that one counterintuitive finding is that good compensation and no risk factors tend to have more pronounced rather than less pronounced traits. For example, social communication difficulties. But yeah, I suppose that would go along with this fact that presumably they have like a really high genetic inheritance for these traits, like they've inherited a lot of the traits. It would suggest that the traits themselves are separate from like pathology, like they're not essentially pathological. A person could have a lot of the traits, and because they're not essentially pathological, the person could be doing quite well in their life if they haven't been exposed to risk factors or anything. Whereas someone might have less traits, but have like been exposed to risk factors, and it's those risk factors that are the most important thing, determining whether someone gets a diagnosis, not necessarily the number of traits themselves. And he also meant, although he didn't really talk about that in great detail, so I'm not entirely sure, I'm just sort of guessing a little bit there. But yeah, females apparently tend to have better compensation. So when they are diagnosed, tend to be more severe, and that's this whole idea, I mean it's theoretical, but it's this whole idea of a female protective effect. So a female needs a greater insult to develop the conditions, and therefore when they do develop them, it tends to be more severe because they've had to be exposed to more risk factors to sort of push them over the edge, sort of thing. That's only a theory though. But even though the traits in many females might be subclinical, they're still liable to develop mental health issues. So yeah, so the important point to come out of this presentation is that ASD is non-binary. It's not a simple either have it or don't have it sort of thing. That basically, say you have like two individuals, say, imagine a graph, yeah, you've got two individuals, X, Y, and these individuals, X, Y, are close to the border of diagnosis. One ends up with the diagnosis, one doesn't, but they're not actually that different to one another functionally, and therefore there's a low agreement, among clinicians, in this instance, say, compared to those at a more extreme level of autism where it's a lot more clear-cut. So when you have two individuals close to the borderline, you're going to find some will say, yeah, they're autistic, others will say, no, they're not, and it becomes a lot harder because it's not so clear-cut. So this is why this model proposes another diagnosis for those who are a bit more subclinical, because often these individuals end up without any diagnosis and they end up like, they just say, bye-bye, you're neurotypical, bye-bye, off you go, and yet they still might have a lot of these autistic traits that are like causing them problems, but they just aren't at the point of diagnosis. This model suggests that maybe a new diagnosis, autistic personality disorder, could actually be applied to these individuals. So they're not at the clinical level of clinical autism, but they have autistic personality disorder. And this means that they're at greater risk for mental health issues, and they might have like lots of sensory issues and things like that. But they're able to compensate to a really extreme extent because of their really good executive functioning, really good IQ. They might not therefore be over the threshold, as it were, and get a diagnosis. So at the lower level you also have what's called an autistic personality, and that's where you have pronounced traits but no disorder. So autistic personality is not the same thing as an autistic personality disorder. An autistic personality won't even come to clinical attention, probably. Or maybe it will if someone is like wanting it for identity purposes, but many of these individuals will just like go about their daily lives and not think too much of it. But autistic personality disorder is like a next step up, where the person is actually experiencing difficulties because of it, but not to the clinically significant extent. But that's obviously not to downplay the difficulties that they have, because they could be quite profound, particularly if they're having mental health problems and things like that. And also those with autistic personality disorder, among those with autistic personality disorder, females are more likely to get multiple diagnoses, for example anorexia. And they should not be called neurotypical and left without support, hence a new diagnosis is proposed, autistic personality disorder. The model also suggests, by the way, that if parents have strong autistic personality, their offspring are at greater risk of experiencing issues from their traits if they're exposed to risk factors. So that could sort of help. Say, like, if a parent is known to have lots of autistic traits, but maybe not to the point of diagnosis, maybe like more interventions, they could intervene more, like say to try and protect the baby from being exposed to risks, because there's a greater risk that the baby would get autism or something. So personality traits exist normally, and also across the population, and traits are independent from one another as well. I'm not quite sure what he meant by that, presumably genetically independent from each other. An impaired ability to deal with the traits may make them problematic. Various environmental and genetic exposures limit that ability. And this non-specifically increases the risk of all disorders, depending upon what genes a person carries. That will determine what specific disorder a person gets, but the actual risk factors themselves are not specific to any one disorder. Okay, so I thought this really interesting, but it's kind of it really has kind of like made me think a lot, and there's a lot of unanswered questions, and I'm going to have to come back to this because I kind of agree with parts of it, but then like at the same time I do feel maybe reality is a little bit more complex. Like I'm not sure about parts of the model, but I do agree with the general thrust of the model. I think it's very plausible. Yeah, I've got so many questions though. It would be great if Darko himself could answer some of them. But yeah, let me know what you think, and thank you for watching.